I think we have a quorum now, so we can start, and then people will keep joining in.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Good evening as well from India. And let me welcome all of you to this very special event, which will be focusing on Europe and India, comparing approaches to the global economic challenges that are confronting us. Let me begin by expressing my deep gratitude to Bruegel and its director, Professor Wolff, and also the president of the Center for Policy Research, Yamini Aiyar, for helping us putting this event together, which I'm sure will be a very stimulating conversation amongst a set of very distinguished panelists that we have participating. So without any further ado, may I give the floor to Yamini, President of CPR, to make some opening remarks. Yamini, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. And on behalf of the Center for Policy Research, it's an absolute privilege for me to welcome all of you to what promises to be an extremely exciting and scintillating 2 days. This is a particularly special occasion because the dialogue was planned some time ago. We started this conversation, I think, actually in mid-2019. Thanks in no small measure, in fact, thanks entirely to Dr. Suman Berry, who is here with us today. Suman is a long-time friend and supporter of the Center for Policy Research and a mentor for many of us, including myself. And over the course of many conversations with him about the Center for Policy Research's engagement on a range of global issues, he had reminded us often about what is a gaping hole, I think, in India's understanding and also in Indian academia, Indian scholarship, and Indian think tanks' understanding of our relationships with Europe. We have some deep bilateral engagements. We do have a broader structured engagement with the EU, but most of this has always remained sporadic. It has always remained issue-based. And even though, as we've seen rather dramatic transitions in the global order, and there seem to be some fairly obvious connections between India and Europe, the ability to leverage these connections, build deeper ties, has always been somewhat under-leveraged in a sense. And part of the reason for that, as Suman has reminded us, is because we actually don't have as deep ties and engagements across the range of stakeholders, most notably across think tanks. In fact, it did strike me when we first started this conversation that it took for Suman to come to institutionalize a dialogue between the Center for Policy Research and Bruegel, and that many of these conversations and dialogues are not organically part of the Indian and European think tank ecosystem. Not to say that we don't have relationships and engagements, but these tend to be much more bilateral, institution to institution relationships that don't necessarily look at the nature of our evolving relationships as nations and what we could collectively do together in our collective commitment to promote a rule-based global order. So thanks to Suman for encouraging us and bringing both Bruegel and CPR together. In our initial conversation, we had planned for a face-to-face dialogue in March of 2020. And as COVID hit the world, I recall a discussion we had internally when various colleagues from Bruegel said that due to travel restrictions, they may not be able to come into India from different parts of the world. world, and some of them would do video presentations. And I have to confess, I scratched my head and said, I just don't see how that would work, because we had not yet discovered the power of Zoom. And so we had found ourselves in a bit of a quandary, and before we could make a decision, everything closed. Borders closed, perhaps for the first time in recent memory, in a non-war-like scenario. And it almost seemed strange to be thinking about a dialogue across nations at a time when suddenly the nation state had become so central to our imaginations as citizens and our understanding of the state. And in fact, the global order almost collapsed around us as borders closed down and citizens started looking at their own nation states, and global institutions didn't quite seem up to the task to responding to what was now a new world and a new challenge. And it is over the months that passed as we discovered the power of technology, and that in fact video-based interactions are not quite as absurd as I had thought back then. So the world has truly changed, even for Luddites like me, that we finally have come back together to organize this dialogue. Not only has the world changed, our forms and ways of engagement have transformed in these last 10 months as well. So this is perhaps one of the most timely opportunities for us to reconnect and bring back to the table the possibilities of a deeper dialogue on India and Europe. We hope to use this platform as an opportunity really for us as countries to get to know each other, as sort of countries and continents to get to know each other, and explore different aspects of the themes that we are focusing on over these next 2 days, which is primarily on geopolitics, on trade, on climate change and technology, as a starting point for what we hope could be a deeper, longer-term continued dialogue, both between us as institutions, as well as across between us as communities of practice. Again, to say none of this would have been possible without Suman. So thank you deeply for this. This was a long time coming, and as things transformed around us, is also perhaps one of the most important conversations to begin, both given how India is repositioning itself, how the world is trying to reimagine itself in a and of course, given the changes in the United States, whose presidency I think is now finally formalized as we come to the table today. And that, of course, will have some bearing both on how we position ourselves as countries and as partners. So thanks everyone for joining us. And I hope that over the course of the next 2 days, not only do we get the opportunity to get to know each other, but that we could also identify common areas of what could potentially be a longer term research agenda and a longer term dialogue and partnership between us as institutions and between us as global players and global actors. With that, may I hand over to Guntram. A very warm welcome to CPR. We hope to have had you in Delhi. I can say the weather is lovely now and the pollution has dropped, so it really would have been very nice to have done this differently, but nonetheless, welcome to CPR Zoom platform. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Yamini, and really let me thank the Center for Policy Research for engaging with us on this very, very important dialogue. It's really a pleasure to be in this call, and I think you've really already described the sort of the history of this attempt, of this event, our attempts to do it in March. And then COVID swept the world, affected the world, and changed our plans, but also changed our ways of interacting, and allows us to find new forms of really doing these kind of dialogues, which I consider of really great importance and great value, not only for us as think tanks, as institutions, but also for the policymakers that we advise. Because the policymakers that we advise, they are very busy, but they do think, and they do have to think a bit more strategically about the long-term options, the long-term engagements for both India and the European Union in a multilateral global world order, as you described very nicely. And so really, I think the topics that we've chosen go to the heart of the conversation that I think we should be having, that really concerns the globe, that concerns also our bilateral relations, and of course concerns multilateral engagement, multilateral platforms. And I think on all these dimensions, we have things to share. We share views, we have some differences, but I think overall there's a lot of overlap also in our thinking in India and in the European Union about many of the topics. And I mean, just to give a quick sense of the various topics, and Yamini, you already mentioned, I think, many of them. So let me perhaps just say a word about climate change, just to sort of give us one little appetizer for one session that will be happening, I think, later tomorrow only. Climate change is really a topic that is not only very urgent and concerns us all. It is a topic where I think the young across the world really share a view. The young across the world, be that India, be that China, be that the United States, or be that Europe, really see climate change as a pressing issue. Surveys confirm that young people are worried about climate change, and Europe has very big ambitions advancing its climate agenda, decarbonizing its economy very quickly. But of course, Europe doing it alone would be meaningless, because Europe on its own only emits less than 10% of global emissions. So really, to be meaningful, one has to think about how can we engage as many countries as possible around the world to decarbonize their economies effectively. And so having that conversation with leading thinkers from India, one of the the second most populous economy in the world, is of crucial importance. And I think there's really an opportunity to think about bilateral engagement, but also multilateral engagement on this topic of climate change. So just to give this one example. So I want to end my introductory remarks by really thanking first of all the Center for Policy Research, Yamini, you personally, but really thanking Ambassador Saran and Senior Fellow André Sapir from Bruegel for really working very intensively on this. And also let me thank Suman Berry of Bruegel, as well as Gautam Mukhopadhyay for their insights and their contribution, and all the speakers, of course, that will speak in the course of the next days. And last but not least, let me thank the audience, all of you, for listening and engaging with us. I really look forward to two stimulating days of conversation. Thank you so much again, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. And before I hand over to Ambassador Saran, I did want to also say a very special thank you to Sandeep Bharadwaj, senior researcher at the Center for Policy Research, who's really patiently, thoughtfully, calmly and carefully worked to put all of this together. And Andre, for all your support over these last few months as we had to rethink format, rethink think, processes, frameworks for the discussion. None of this would have been possible without the two of you. And of course, without the able mentorship and stewardship of Suman, this would still have remained just a little idea that never came to pass. So thanks to all three of you. And with that, I'll hand over to Ambassador Saran to take us forward through the day.
Thank you very much, Yamini. And since we have a limited amount of time, I think we can get into our proceedings without any further ado. So as you are aware, we have 4 sessions altogether. The topics have already been listed out. And I think what we have decided, Andre and myself, we are going to be serving as co-chair, that for each session, we will sort of reverse our roles. For session 1 and 3, I will, do the introductory remarks and also call upon our panelists to make their presentations, also moderate the question and answer sessions, and then request Andre to do the concluding remarks. And then for the next session, we will reverse this order. So that is the way in which we have structured our discussions. So let me, for this first session, where we are really going to be looking at the geopolitical, landscape, the strategic environment in which we find ourselves today, and what are the kind of perspectives that India and the European Union have with respect to some of these very, very major, deflections which are taking place in our in the various trends in the international affairs. So that's really going to be the focus. Before I get on to the subject itself, let me first of all introduce my co-chair, Andre, and then also the panelists who will be taking part in this particular session. So Andre is, of course, senior fellow in Bruegel. He is also a university professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and also research fellow of the London-based Center for Economic Policy Research. And between 1990 and 2004, he worked for the European Commission, and first as an economic advisor to the Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs, and then as Principal Economic Advisor to President Prodi, who was also, and he was also heading the Economic Advisory Group. In 2004, he published an agenda for a growing Europe, a report to the President of the Commission by a group of independent experts that is known as the Sapir report. And after leaving the Commission, he first served as external member of President Barroso's Economic Advisory Group, and then as a member of the General Board and chair of the Advisory Scientific Committee of the European Systemic Risk Board, which is based in the European Central Bank in Frankfurt. Andre has written extensively on European integration, on international trade and globalization. He holds a PhD in economics from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he worked under the supervision of Bela Balassa, and he was elected member of the Academia Europea and the Royal Academy of Belgium for Science and for the Arts. So that's very distinguished, career of Andre Sapir, senior fellow at Bruegel. And the two panelists that we have, of course, Alicia. Let me try and get to the. Yeah, so Alicia is Alicia Garcia Herrero, who's also senior fellow at Bruegel. She's a senior fellow and also the chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis and non-resident research fellow at the Madrid-based policy think tank, Real Instituto Elcano. I hope I'm getting it right in terms of pronunciation. She is currently adjunct professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology and a member of the advisory board of the Berlin-based China think tank MERIX. Finally, Alicia is advisor to the Hong Kong Monetary Authority's research arm and the Asian Development Bank, as well as member of the board of the Hong Kong Forum and co-founder of Bright Hong Kong. In previous years, Alicia held the following positions: chief economist for emerging markets at Banco Bilbao Vizcaya and Argentaria, and member of the Asian Research Program at the Bank of International Settlements, head of the International Economy Division of the Bank of Spain, member of the Council to the Executive Board of the European Central Bank. And I think, maybe perhaps we can cut down the introductions because I think we are running a little out of time. So may I just make a few remarks? As I said, this particular session is devoted to really looking at the geopolitical landscape, the international landscape, particularly in the impact that the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic is going to have with respect to various power equations amongst major powers, but also what it is doing to many regional issues as well. Generally, one would like to say that so far it seems to be that the pandemic has in a sense accelerated many of the trends that were already apparent before the pandemic erupted. And in some senses, there are, one cannot say that there are no new trends which it has in a sense, engendered. For example, yes, it has led to the acceleration of the process of digitization, for example. But that acceleration itself is perhaps in turn generating other impulses which we have to take into account. We have the the emergence of China as one of the most important powers in the international landscape. This was already apparent before the pandemic. It had, in fact, perhaps been accelerating since the global financial and economic crisis of 2007, 2008. But it is a fact that even though the pandemic may have started in China, but China has been, in fact, the country which has the one major economy which has emerged, perhaps most rapidly from the impact of the pandemic. And this gives it a certain advantage. It puts in a sort of a pole position with respect to the post-COVID global economy. So if we are looking at what the prospects are for the global economy, we have to take into account that the recovery process, even if the vaccine becomes widely available, it will still take time before it really has a major impact. The global economy is probably going to remain somewhat slow for the next several years. It is also likely that there will be a kind of a reshuffling of the major players in the international landscape. We have not much idea as to what the the incoming administration in the United States, what will this mean for the prospects of the global economy? Europe, as far as I can see, after a process of some internal strain and some, toward a trend towards some fragmentation, seems to be coming back together again, despite Brexit. And that's a very hopeful sign. We also see on the climate change issue that Dr. Wolff talked about, that there seems to be a new sort of impetus towards perhaps getting serious about climate change action. But getting serious about climate change action means also who will do the, who will deploy the resources, where will the resources come from, where will technology come from? And all this will have an impact as well on the global, landscape. So let me stop here. And what I'll do is I'll first invite Ambassador Guntram Mukhopadhyay to perhaps make his presentation. Guntram is, of course, a very, very close colleague. He has served as a member of the Indian Foreign Service until his retirement recently. He has served in very important countries to India, like, for example, Afghanistan. He has served, like me, in Myanmar. He has a great interest in, India's Northeast, and particularly its relationship with Southeast Asia. He is currently a visiting senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. He also leads a committee of the Niti Aayog for the Northeast, and he's also a advisor, I think, in several other fora. I will not list them. So Guntram will be talking to us, giving us his perspective, a kind of an Indian perspective on the global economy and how that fits into this larger global landscape that I spoke about. So Guntram, with that introduction, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, sir. Ms. Yamini Aiyar, President CPR, Dr. Guntram Wolff, Director Bruegel, Ambassador Saran, and Mr. Andre Sapir, Dr. Suman Berry, my fellow panelists, Ms. Alicia Garcia Herrero, and distinguished participants. It is a privilege to participate in the long-anticipated CPR Bruegel webinar on Europe and India, on our approaches to global challenges, which I widen from just economic challenges, with a view to identifying the full potential of cooperation between Europe and India. I share the view expressed in the note for this event that this potential is not fully realized. One of the striking things about the India-EU Roadmap for Strategic Partnership 2025, signed this July, is that it is very rich on the agenda of modernization and adaptation, focused on frontier areas of the economy, regulation, climate change, technology, and security issues. These are very important to both of us and well reflected in our agenda the next 2 days. Yet beyond the foundational language of common values of democracy, human rights, fundamental freedoms, and a rules-based global order centered on multilateralism through the United Nations, WTO, WHO, who are all facing serious challenges, amongst other organizations, it touches very lightly on real strategic and political issues that affect us in real time. There is very little sense of what India and EU think on some of the geopolitical issues and political values facing us and the world. So in the 13-14 minutes that I have, I will focus more on the global strategic environment and the clash of values facing us and the world, both as it appears to government and to civil society, leaving other issues to the dedicated sessions that we have on trade and the economy, climate change, and technological trends shaping the world. Broadly speaking, 2020 has been dominated by 3 international developments that are emblematic of larger processes that have been at work for some time. The COVID-19 pandemic, an aggressive China, and the US elections, representing the man and nature relationship and transnational threats, geopolitics, and political values. In addition, for us in India, 4 regional developments have also weighed on us. The India-China clash and standoff at the line of actual control, on the India-China border, the US pullout from Afghanistan, our progressively deteriorating relations with Pakistan, and our inability to sign on to the RCEP at a time when the domestic, regional, and world economy are all trying to emerge from the shock of COVID-19. On the one hand, from an economic and existential point of view, the pandemic has called into question some of our unsustainable modes of production and consumption and global value chains and their relationship with climate change and living organisms that should not be lost in a return to business as usual. On the other hand, from a strategic point of view, it is reordering the China-India, US-China, and probably the China-West relationship. Geopolitically, over the last 4 decades, we have moved from a bipolar to a briefly unipolar to what is often called a multipolar world. Although we too like using that phrase because I suppose it makes us feel important, we are more accurately in a tricentric world in which the security agenda is dominated by a hitherto erratic US, a rising, assertive, and increasingly aggressive China, and an arguably revanchist Russia. It is not that other industrial powers or groupings like the EU, or for that matter, India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, or others, are not shaping the political, economic, or regional agenda. They are. But few can act as independent poles by themselves. Even the EU, which is perhaps closest to being a major power status amongst these. They all need one or the other major power to shape geopolitics. A good example of this is in Afghanistan. This is also one very good reason why the EU and India need a closer strategic dialogue. Yet, while there have been any number of flashpoints, frictions, and military interventions over Iraq, Syria, Libya, the Ukraine, Yemen, North Korea, and most recently Armenia and Azerbaijan, none have tipped over into a conflict between major powers. One of the questions that worries us is how COVID-19 is changing or has changed this unstable tricentric equilibrium. With China's quick recovery from a pandemic, for which it is most responsible, it is acting with what Ambassador Shamsaran has called elsewhere, a mixture of hubris and insecurity, and revealing itself as a sullen power. Its response to the pandemic seems to be to sense a moment of opportunity while the world is preoccupied, to go on the offensive, to settle its unfinished national agenda from Hong Kong to Xinjiang to Tibet and Inner Mongolia, evidently with a view to precipitating a resolution of its claims in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, especially Taiwan, and the India-China border in its favor, if necessary, militarily. Pakistan and North Korea seem to be handy dependents on this agenda. We would very much value your assessment of China's behavior on this. In India, it has also raised the specter of a two-front or even a two-and-a-half-front war. It is stretching out to the Indian Ocean through its Belt and Road initiatives, through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, the Indian Ocean, including possibly through the Kra Canal in future, and through Central Asia, Pakistan, and Afghanistan to Iran and the Persian Gulf. It is also stretching deeply into Europe, Africa, and Latin America through the BRI, investments, and influence operations. It is at the same time unrolling an alternative universe of initiatives and institutions, ranging from the BRI and the AIIB to its parallel digital world and large corporations that aim to replace the Western world order with a Chinese world order, Chinese-led order. It is also impacting heavily on the entire ASEAN-centered political, economic, and security architecture in the Asia-Pacific that ASEAN leaders are trying their level best to balance. But ASEAN's increasing dependence on China in coming out of the pandemic is not a good augury. Its belligerence and wolf warrior diplomacy is also affecting China-West and especially China-US dynamics. Although it predated the novel coronavirus, as Ambassador Sharon pointed out, it has definitely hastened the process, sharpened the fault lines, and aggravated and exacerbated underlying contradictions and grievances, ranging from loss of jobs to technology theft to unequal terms of trade, amongst other things. To possibly a point where, at least under President Trump, things were getting only worse. It is to be seen whether President-elect Biden will be able to contain and moderate China without heading towards a Cold War. With the concentration of power and empowerment of all the instruments of the party and state under Xi Jinping, the whole idea behind globalization, that politics and economics could function in parallel and somehow converge at some point in a kind of second end of history, has been blown open. The rise of China as an economic and military power is also questioning the conventional wisdom that while China is no doubt rising and assertive, there is still a wide gap, to use the Chinese term, in its comprehensive national power between the US and China. In reality, China is able to use both its asymmetry and its lower power much more effectively than the US. The widespread protests against the police killing of George Floyd in the US reflects the US's unwieldy use of power and the damage to its international image like little else, even as China gets away with much worse. All these developments raise the issue of how the world will respond to the rise of a belligerent China. The immediate answer seems to be the Quad. Is this the time for the Quad to finally take shape? If so, will it inaugurate a new Cold War, this time centered on the Indo-Pacific? Do the recent statements by Germany, France, and the UK on the Indo-Pacific presage a larger coalition, perhaps informal? Will ASEAN lose its centrality or even fracture over these choices and their own security concerns individually? Is there anything that the Indo-Pacific can learn from 20th century Europe in this regard? We would very much value your views in this. Theoretically, India stands to benefit from China's behavior in the region, but in actual fact, India itself faces serious challenges in its foreign policy, not to mention economy. China's serious aggressions along the line of control, the chronic problems of Pakistan, and the US troop withdrawal in Afghanistan on its continental frontiers, and its failure to join the RCP on the other hand. Declining growth, the COVID lockdown, and economic dislocation and contraction are others factors haunting us. I would have liked to spend some time on our relations with the US, Russia, and the regional strategic and security environment from West to East Asia, the United Nations, and multilateralism. But we could perhaps leave that for our discussion. I want to quickly turn to the issue of values and some key issues affecting us. At the start of my talk, I had used the term triad to describe the dominant powers. During and even the Cold War, major powers spoke in the name of some greater good in one form or the other. Today, harder forms of realism based on military power and self-interest, my country first, dominate the international relations discourse as rarely before. The European Union and ASEAN, two important strategic partners for India, are founded based on mutual interest and a communitarian idea, but both have also been beneficiaries of the US. What would happen if this self-centric discourse were to prevail within the EU? We've already seen the effect. How will that affect the Union? By extension, can my country first be a viable base? Can the power? We can take this further as manifested in the US elections. Is there a clash between a liberal order that we associate with Europe and an almost worldwide authoritarian or majoritarian trend? Illiberal tendencies have not spared us either. We are seeing them in India and in Europe. As unions of diversity, to use a memorable phrase in a European document, where do India and Europe stand on this? Will the election of Joe Biden in the US give a boost to democratic liberalism that was almost on the ropes? We cannot deny that it is not simply a clash between liberalism and authoritarianism or populism or majoritarianism. We also need to examine the crisis of liberalism bordering on an elitism of a privileged middle class everywhere that has generated its antithesis. Again, the rise of racist right-wing groups in the US and the Black Lives Matter movement provide ready references. But the US is by no means unique in this. In India, we too have had initiatives like the NRC, the National Register of Citizens, and the CAA, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and opposition to it. Today, we have the farm bills and international expressions of concern over it. that throw open other questions of economic inclusion, strategies, the role of farmers. As Indian and European think tanks, we should consider addressing these issues. Looking outside interstate relations too, there are social, economic and technological forces impacting on domestic politics and international relations negatively. I touched on right-wing populism in the West and elsewhere, with streaks of isolationism, nationalism, racism, and anti-Islamism. But we also face religious fundamentalism, extremism, and terrorism in swaths of Asia, particularly West Asia, spilling over into South and Southeast Asia, and the rabid use of social media for the politics of identity and emotions. Impacting on the politics are also the existential challenge of climate change and pandemics manifested so dramatically in COVID-19, cybersecurity and cyber warfare, globalization with its economic uncertainties, inequalities, and discontents, and the impact of COVID on the global, regional, and domestic economies and global value chains, as also health security. Together, they have created a potent cocktail that could easily trigger flashpoints or engulf countries and regions. The convergence of new technologies like ICT, artificial intelligence, and robotics have raised Orwellian concerns over the unprecedented capacity of states and corporations to monitor and control the lives of ordinary citizens as never before. These are being expedited by COVID in ways we still do not know or understand, as Ambassador Sharan referred. Some of these will be dealt in the 3 sessions that follow, but 2 deserve attention here. The frictions between Islam and other religions and within Islam that we see widespread in Europe, where it has resurfaced dramatically in France, Africa, where it is manifested in fundamentalist violence within Islam, in Nigeria, Mali, and the Sahara, in West Asia, where we have seen brutal forms in the Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and their offshoots in Iraq, Syria, the Levant, and more in Afghanistan. In South and Southeast Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Indonesia, amongst others less severely, in relation to Hinduism and Buddhism. And in a very different way in Xinjiang in China, where the clash is between ethnicity and religion against a racist and authoritarian state. I'm sorry for that harsh description, but there can be no denying that there is an element of Han racism behind the suppression of ethnicity and religion, not just in Xinjiang, but also Tibet and Inner Mongolia. My last point, sir. The second issue worthy of flagging here is a separate but related phenomenon, is the demonization of minorities, polarization of societies, and the politics of hate, perpetrated behind the anonymity of social media, compounded by the massive power of giant corporates behind social media organizations, and exacerbated by their hold over big data, algorithms, and information flows. While no doubt social media has also many positive and liberating effects, including in the struggle against repression and media blackouts, I'm sure data and privacy aspects will be dealt in the session on technology. What we are concerned about here is the potential for fake and fabricated news and political violence inherent in these media that we have seen exercised time and again. I flagged this to ask if this is also not something that we should add to our political and security dialogue, along with those like non-proliferation, terrorism, maritime security, naval cooperation, cybersecurity, and organized crime that are already there. I will end with that, since I've more or less exhausted my time. On the other issues that we've left out on regional security and big power relations, I think we could touch on in our discussions. Thank you. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Gautam, for a very comprehensive presentation. You have given us a broad brush view of what the geopolitical landscape looks like today, and what is its likely sort of evolution in the days to come. And of course, this is very intimately linked with what the economic trends are going to be. And Alicia, who will be following you, will be essentially focusing on the economic aspect, and in particular on what is the likelihood of, for example, the US-China trade and economic tensions not only continuing but perhaps intensifying under the new administration, or is that going to take perhaps a somewhat different turn? what is certainly obvious is that this kind of a competition is now linked to a overall strategic competition between the two powers, the number one power and the number two power. So it might have started off as a economic and trade related conflict, but it has now been subsumed in a much larger sort of strategic contest between the two sides. And I think in terms of ordering our economies, the question does arise, which Alicia will be looking at, is where do we fit into this this kind of a competition? Because for several of us, India less, but certainly if you look at Southeast Asia, East Asia, there is a wariness about China as far as the security aspect is concerned, but there is also a great interest in keeping engaged with China as far as the economic and trade side is concerned, because they have benefited from that relationship. The same goes for Europe as well, that it has, over the years developed a very strong economic and trade relationship with China. And even though in Europe itself, there is a certain concern about China's, rather aggressive kind of posture on many issues. There is not much willingness to really, in a sense, dilute the economic and trade relationship. So bringing that balance is something which is going to be a particularly difficult challenge. As has been pointed out, we may be pushed more and more to choose one or the other side, but we don't want to choose, or at least neither East Asia or Southeast Asia, and I suspect Europe as well, may not wish to make that very sharp kind of a stark choice. So in that context, what is going to be the impact on the global economy? And in that sense, what is it that India and Europe can do together? So to perhaps speak about some of these issues, we have Alicia. Alicia, you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And I'm going to share my presentation. I hope that you can all see it. Let me know otherwise. Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Good.
Sure.
So I understand that we don't have much time left, so I'll try to be brief. I'm going to talk indeed about what India and Europe can do in the midst of US-China strategic competition. And although I'm an economist, I happen to like geopolitics quite a lot. So this is going to be a mixture of the two, since they can't really be separated. So the first thing is that we need to realize, who are we talking about here? The EU and India are the largest economic blocs other than the major powers, or at least hegemons, or those involved in great power competition, which is the US and China. In a way, India and Europe are big but different, because as you can see from this graph, below the line you have the size of major economies in the world, and this is calculated in purchasing power parity. I say this upfront because India might look big on the upper part of the graph, meaning as a contribution to global growth, but a lot of that is because of exchange rate effects. But having said that, it's still very, very big. So below the line, you have basically Europe, depending on how you calculate the exchange rate and purchasing power parity, as big as the US, if not bigger. Same for China. So kind of balance. But on the upper side, what matters in a way, because this is about new growth, new opportunities, meaning contribution to global growth in billion, actually trillion of US dollar. The first by far is China, slightly less than half India, and then you have the US, and then you have Europe, and then you have Japan. So in a way, Europe and India, if I may say, are complementary, because they're like somehow like the US and China, meaning US is bigger now, or but China is so much bigger, and this is what explains why the Southeast Asian countries you were referring to, why they are so interested in China, because they look at new opportunities, not past opportunities. This is why this graph explains a lot of what we are experiencing. And we are old, we have size, Europe, you have the future, you have new growth, new contribution. So in that regard, there's this complementarity that I will come back to in a minute. Now I'm going to talk about what's really happening from the economic perspective, which is this decoupling. How far are we? There is some decoupling, but the direction is still uncertain. We have a new administration in the US, obviously. And because we don't know about the direction of the decoupling, it's kind of hard to react because we don't know whether it's going to continue. We don't know whether re-globalization forces are going to dominate the policy agenda, or on the other hand, or actually on the contrary, this decoupling will push additional deglobalization. So because we don't know that, it's very hard to react because we don't know how far apart this great power competition is going to push economies, the two economies, and perhaps the rest of the world in a kind of two ecosystem model. So if we look at the data, how far are we in terms of decoupling? And of course, there's many ways to look at this, but if one looks at actual trade between the US and China, there has been a very rapid deceleration since 2017. So basically since Trump came to power, except for recently, except for basically after COVID type reality. But still, even if there has been some upward trend in bilateral relations, there's two reasons. First, China needs to comply with phase one deal requirements, 200 billion, and they're very far behind this. So they need to push the accelerator on their imports. And you can see it, yeah, it's like since 2019, this is basically the phase one deal. And in terms of exports, Chinese exports, that recovery that may look strong still grows at zero. And if you can see from the right-hand side of the graph, the US is the one and only, well, there may be others, but in terms of major economies, Japan, Europe, US, that is actually decreasing the market share of Chinese exports. In other words, Chinese exports are decreasing their market share in the US. Not in Europe, not in Japan, and certainly not in ASEAN, or actually massively increasing, especially since COVID. So look at the end of the graph. That fall means that even if we see some increase, actually the US is no longer relying on China as much as it used to for its imports. And this is important. Beyond trade, I want to make this point about tech decoupling. And I actually wrote a piece for the OFR, your think tank in India's think tank, on this topic, on tech decoupling. And I think it's very important because it's very hard to capture in any measure. The only thing I have here in terms of number is approved licenses. So basically the amount of export controls of sensitive technology in the US. And you can see that the approved licenses are coming down. So the growth basically is clearly negative. And this basically means that the US is tightening. But frankly speaking, it's tightening with the whole world. I didn't show that, but I could show it to you. It's just more in China. But it is a general reality. Beyond hardware, yeah, I mean, that we know is happening. So we have the ban, the identity list, which basically bans the export of semiconductors to China, not only from the US, but even from Taiwan, from Japan, etc., with exceptions, obviously. So you have the hardware, but you also have the software. And of course, you know, we had the amazing case of WeChat and TikTok as a landmark case. And of course, I know that India has also taken some actions in this regard. We could discuss later. But I think this is really pushing a kind of a two ecosystem. And I think this is extremely important for Europe and India, because the key question is, will we be independent in terms of technology so as to avoid falling one side or the other? Or can we do that? Is it too late? Can we join forces? You know, there's a number of issues that could be discussed here of great relevance, in my opinion, for EU-India economic relations. People to people, another type of decoupling. Of course, decoupling is a big word. I understand that. I mean, not because we have fewer visas being approved, we can say that there's no movement of people. But I think we need to acknowledge that on a targeted basis, there has been some sort of decoupling. Perhaps you can say that this is a general trend. As you see in my graph, the number of visa refusals in the US has increased even for India without any difference, Italy, you know, even European countries. But we know that there is a targeted approach to visa refusal from China. If we didn't believe that that was the case, the US administration told us up front, very recently, in terms of the ban on Chinese Communist Party members from traveling to the US. How this is going to be applied is still, you know, in the making, but it is very relevant to understand that kind of targeted decoupling of people-to-people exchanges. The other potential aspect of decoupling is finance, and this is so much harder because we all know that money is the most, you know, tradable and movable factor of production ever, and it's always very hard to stop. But we see some signs, and we need to realize this. In terms of bilateral FDI, so foreign direct investment between the US and China, you already see that 2016 was a peak and of China into the US. So this is, of course, 2017, we have the reform of CFIUS, the Committee of Foreign Investment in the United States, which basically plummets investment from China into the US, so acquisitions of assets or companies. And then you see that even the US investment into China actually slows down, actually a very, very stagnant graph, as you can see there, very, very rapidly as a percentage of US GDP. And I mean, not rapidly, slowly, but steadily since 2003. Some people think that the US is a big investor in China, and this is actually not accurate. Taiwan is a big investor in the mainland, but not the US. And to some extent, actually not to some extent, Europe is a larger investor in China than the US. So that decoupling that we think is impossible is actually, if you ask me, such a minor part of the US GDP. So let's not forget that the US and China are, of course, integrated, but not so much in terms of foreign direct investment. I want to focus on this theme. Finance as such, portfolio investment, IPOs. I'm here showing you the number of Chinese corporates listed in the US, or is increasing. There's still a lot of interactions on the portfolio side, but again, this is at risk because we have had many kinds of beyond the identity list, which is a kind of tech-related list that I mentioned. A number of other types of sanction-related lists, whether it's Xinjiang, whether it's Hong Kong, or the most recent one, the so-called Pentagon list, which is about to be expanded, according to Reuters, to 89. This is big. Major SOEs in China, which deal with all kinds of sectors by now, because we have chemical companies, we have already ChemChina. The rumors is that airline companies, because the list has been expanded. I mean, we just don't know the new companies in the expanded list. Airlines, of course, we have AI companies. We have, but it goes well beyond, the narrow framework of military-related companies. And I think we need to realize that if China has by now 134, I believe, Fortune 500 companies, if 89 of those are targeted in terms of sanctions. This is a big thing. I just want to remind the audience that part of these companies are now being taken out of the indices. Russell, for example, FT Russell has already announced that it will take out, I think, 4 to 5 of these companies from its index. So it is relevant for investors, and I think it's going to, if not fully decouple, basically reduce the interactions, or at least limit the financial interactions between China and the US. Now, beyond the decoupling, there's another story, which I think is very important for India, but also for Europe, is that because of the fear, maybe we're not yet in full decoupling, but the fear of decoupling, there is other things are happening because countries have to do something about it, yeah? And as the US calls upon its allies to align them with the US-China policies, China is also kind of reacting to that by creating a number of course, we can think about the Belt and Road Initiative. I didn't mention that because I think it's really is now, I don't think it's disappearing, but it's treated on a very low key front. You can see that from the 5th plenum, and the draft of the 14th five-year plan is really not there. So I want to focus on RCEP because it's very important for India, and I actually think it's important for Europe too, which shows that everybody is creating blocks. I wanted to also mention the USMCA because we actually see it in written, basically, that this poison pill, which could actually stop China, and this is based on Xi Jinping's announcement at the APEC meeting, because there is a veto power between CPTPP members, it could actually make this announcement that Xi Jinping made, that China could envisage participating in CPTPP, actually impossible. And why? Because the new trade blocks are being built in a way, I mean, implicitly or explicitly in the case of USMCA, with clauses to basically belong to one side or the other. This is so important for Europe and India because we're too big to get into this. We just can't. And thus we need to find other ways to deal with our role in the world. So of course, again, there's many ways to envisage what our role in the world could be. But I'm just focusing here on how to avoid the trap. The trap meaning being forced to choose, as you know, we were hearing before. And I think one, of course, is I just follow basically my alliances, my place in the world. Let's put it this way. So, you know, Europe is part of NATO. We have the Indo-Pacific strategy. Of course, we can think of ways to link the two. And we have had interesting comments by Chancellor Merkel on this. But the point is, this is the status quo. We can mix it around, but this is we can grow it. But this is the status quo. And by the way, it means taking sides. Let's not forget that. Now, what else can we do if we really don't want to take sides? Well, of course, I mean, this may sound a little bit maybe aggressive or arrogant, but I really want to say this because I think it's important. We are, I go back to the previous point at the first slide of my presentation, big. I mean, I can understand that a small country in the middle of Asia has no choice, but we should have a choice. And I think one way beyond what we are also doing, looking for our economic sovereignty. This is a very, very, you know, like trendy thing to say in Europe. It might not be enough. So what about finding new alliances that are indeed non-aligned? Yeah, and this brings us to the Cold War, I'm afraid. But if you allow yourself to one of the two contenders of great power competition, you can't expect to be non-aligned. It's just impossible. So what can we do? I think, of course, trade and investment are obvious ways to do this, because economics is always easier than creating security alliances, and I don't think we could do that, because we don't even have the strength, military strength, to do that. The other very interesting point is that, and I hear this all the time, many times around, I get this comment: why isn't Europe leading a force of not aligned? Meaning, I want to jump on your boat. I want to jump on the boat of somebody which could actually be strategically independent, or now maybe Europe can do it alone. Maybe Europe and India can do it, and then have other countries coming along. How to do it? I think the most obvious and benign way is to start with trade and investment, and you can also use the reform of the WTO. And if nobody else wants to come along, I think the whole point is everybody else, rather than a major, a great power competition, could come along if we were to start this. As you all know, the EU has started already with the reform of the appellate body, to which I believe 15 countries have followed. So the idea is maybe make it stronger by having EU and India more aligned. All in all, the point of this presentation really is to show that while small countries may have no choice, I think India and Europe could have a choice. And it is easy to just go along the status quo, and this is, of course, in existing security alliances, or even basically go with the flow. Yeah, but those security alliances, let's not hide the reality, do not ensure a market. The US is not opening a market to Europe with a the free trade agreement, which we tried. So they are not complete. The Indo-Pacific Alliance is not a trade and investment agreement. So we need to find ways to basically, in my humble opinion, find that strategic economic autonomy, but also find alliances. And I think EU-India, although as crazy as it might look, because we've never gone this way, because of size and complementarity of future growth versus current size, are indeed a possibility, which at least should be explored with relevant strategic dialogue. And I think this is something that I hope this seminar can push along. So enough with the two hegemonic contenders. We know them well, but we also have our interests, our size, and our strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for that very stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. Nothing would make me happier than a India-EU alliance, if that were possible, and if the two together could lead another non-aligned movement, so much the better. The problem that I think we will confront is that we are in a situation where both the economic trade investment as well as the security side, they have become entangled together. So if you say, look at China, to give you an example, China is using its economic power and trading power to punish countries which do not conform to its own security sort of perspective. This is a dilemma that all of us are facing, that on the one hand, we want to take advantage of this growing economy, because there are not many other sources of growth, as you showed in the global economy. Therefore, we want to take advantage of that. But taking advantage of that also means that your dependency on that particular economy is increasing, and therefore your vulnerability to political pressure, to security threat also is increasing. Great example is what Australia is going through today. Yeah. very strong economic relationship, and yet China is, in fact, using that to try and bring Australia into line that China believes it should be in. It can't do exactly the same thing to the United States, but if the United States is using that pressure, we see it on the other side too. So I think it is, to my mind, it's a little difficult to think whether we can sort of abstract from the security aspect and try to build up a economic alliance. I think we will have to do some kind of a balancing of the two, because I think this is where the crunch comes. So if the United States of America is a very important security partner for Europe, then if it says no 5G, otherwise I will not give you access to various other things. So I mean, how do we unravel that? So I think this is something that we need to, as you have said at the end of your paper, I think these are things which we need to perhaps discuss much more, engage with each other much more, as to how do we reconcile these very different kind of pulls and pressures that we are subjected to. And as far as India is concerned, even though we had a very strong economic and trade relationship with China, but that is now diminishing, of course, and it is diminishing not because of any economic issue as such, but it is diminishing because of the security aspect. That is having an impact on the economic and trade relationship. So how do we sort of square this circle is what I think we will need to confront. Before I get to the question and answer session, so that you can have a chance to respond to some of the comments that have been made, I will ask Gautam and then you subsequently, if there are any thoughts which have come up in these two presentations, which perhaps either we want to take forward or we want to perhaps have some more clarity on. Gautam, only 5 minutes. If you can please give us another set of observations, especially after listening to what Alicia has had to say.
Right. So thank you, sir. Firstly, I think I would like to compliment Ms. Alicia Garcia Herrero for her presentation. It's a very interesting idea. I think something that has not been very widely floated, or at least in the public sphere. The whole idea that there is a space between US and China, that two large economies that are very different from small economies that are dependent on one or the other can actually forge both an economic and a technological alliance. And that the way to go about this is possibly through bilateral free trade treaties, investment treaties, and so on. So, I think this is a very interesting idea, but we probably need to examine, some of the issues. In the last round of talks on our free trade agreement, we ran into the devil of details. And I think we appear to have forgotten the strategic picture which was behind it. We have to bear in mind that, we found it difficult. The question of the TTP was out. We found it very difficult to even join the RCEP. One of the arguments was, of course, China. But the other argument was simply, the lack of competitivity of a lot of sectors of our economy. Agriculture, dairy was on one side, for which China was not the predicate, it was other countries. But even in the area of manufacturing, there were issues relating to East Asia and to even ASEAN. And we've had bilateral free trade agreements with Japan, with Korea, with Singapore. And by and large, they have not worked too well. Initially, our exports increased and thereafter they stagnated. And then, we got caught in a kind of complaints between the two sides on who's getting more advantage out of the arrangement as well. So given that we have faced these problems with East Asia, how will we overcome these problems with Europe? Will Europe be able to take into consideration that our economy is extremely differentiated? You have a competitive global segment, but you also have large segments that really require protection, and even a kind of, or at least that's what the government thinks. And the government has embarked on what it calls the self-reliance strategy.
Yeah.
At the same time, it wants to be part of global value chains. And there's a bit of a contradiction between the two. But I think the idea behind the self-reliance is not autarky, or not completely closing in itself, so that there is an opportunity with the European Union. I think, in fact, as a kind of rebound from the RCEP issue, the European Free Trade Agreement seems like a very good idea at the moment.
Yeah.
And the basic idea is exactly what you said, reduce dependence on particularly China. I think we talk about major powers, but particularly China, and that increase our collaboration, cooperation, etc., with what we can call middle powers, or at least not the dominant sort of, as you use the word somewhat fleetingly, hegemonic powers. So I think the question really comes down to is, if we could not make it work with East Asia, how can we make it work with the European Union? And what would the European Union need to do to take into account India's current economic, condition? And this issue also spills over into other issues like climate change. In climate change, Europe has a far more ambitious agenda, but we know that we are in a much more fragile situation, and that if we were to move to that situation from today to tomorrow, basically the system would give way. And we obviously need to take into account many other historical and other differentiated things. But the point is, how do you deal with a country that is much less developed than the European Union?
Yeah, thank you very much, Gautam. I think the issue here is, while we have the big picture that Alicia has put forward, are there some practical steps that we can take to at least begin a journey towards that kind of destination? Whether it eventually comes about or not, that's a different matter. And I think one of the points that you mentioned, which is that the problem with the RCEP has been essentially China. The concern that becoming part of RCEP means, in effect, becoming a part of a free trade agreement with China. And what does that mean, in terms of the vulnerability of the Indian economy to Chinese economic ingress? So there is perhaps a opportunity here, as you said, to revive the idea of a strong economic and trade partnership between India and the EU. Just to point out that, when I was serving as Foreign Secretary, actually we came very close to having a very comprehensive economic and trade partnership between India and the EU. And my great regret is that finally it did not come through because of what I consider in retrospect as somewhat not so important, sort of technical issues, whether it was in terms of, wine or cheese. I think we lost the plot in a sense, because we got entangled in these technical issues, tactical issues, and perhaps forgot the larger picture in terms of the strategic partnership between India and the EU. And just to say that I was also involved in the negotiations on the strategic partnership between India and the EU in 2005. And there was a sense that really India and the European Union can be very, very significant partners in terms of the global landscape that we are discussing today. For example, that here are two entities which are multicultural, multilingual, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. They are examples of successful plural democracies, but also that the plural democracy concept is under assault. It was already a sense at that time that we were under pressure as plural democracies. That in fact is much worse today, some of the points that you made, Gautam, itself in your presentation. So is that something which is no longer relevant? Is that something that we should also be really thinking about, that this is something which is worth preserving? Secondly, we also talked about how Europe and India were really at two stable bookends, in a sense, of a zone of instability and unrest in between. And how do we deal with that? I think that still continues to be the case. And now, of course, we have the additional challenge of China. So I would like to ask Alicia whether we need to sort of revisit that larger picture. Number two, is there some way you think that we can revive our engagement on perhaps a comprehensive economic and trade partnership? Is this something that looks feasible if we both really make an effort in that direction? Alicia?
Thank you very much. Thanks for all of your comments. I realize that by hearing you, I may look very naive, but I'm going to push my argument, if you allow me. And I'm going to push it for a number of reasons. 2005, 15 years ago, the risk that idea of a great power competition wasn't as obvious, let's face it. We had not yet gone through the global financial crisis, which is the turning point as to what we're seeing today. It's in the Chinese mind, and I've been here, living here for enough years to realize that's the demise of the West, 2008. So the West now, and let's put the US aside, because I guess that's the whole point. We don't want to be either or. The West, meaning Europe now, realizes this. So I don't think the West doesn't want to decline, because this is a demographic and historical, super cycle. The point is how you decline. And I think Europe now is increasingly aware, and probably, I would argue, terrified by exactly the points you made. So the EU's approach to new alliances has to be different, and we have the proof of that. The proof of the pudding, in my opinion, is the FTA with Vietnam. The ILO conventions weren't ratified. There was a plan for ratification. With a country like Vietnam, you are India. You see what I mean? Like, I think Europe, in that subtle decline, let's put it this way, is aware of its weaknesses. And I don't come here to, I'm not an ambassador. I just want to say really what I believe. But Europe has a lot to offer because it has standards. It has what I would call the way to do things. Doesn't necessarily need to do things anymore because we are late in ICT. We're late. So in a way, I think that's a lot. And then on top of that, you think your market is closed and we would not be willing to engage because you are at a different level of development. I'm sorry to say, China has been offering closed markets and very, very little market access on the back of a huge market. You have the huge market too. Your income per capita is lower, but China's income per capita in 25 was also lower. And we bought into the story. So I actually think, and I need to end with one more positive. Sorry to look a little bit over the top, but it's my opportunity to push this, because I truly believe that it is I would say possible, but it is to be explored, because we don't have too many other options. And here's why, my last point, because you think you are dependent on China. You may think Europe is dependent on China. Actually, we are hardly dependent on China compared to the rest, except the US. That is absolutely the case. Your trade with China is very small compared to any country in Southeast Asia. Our trade with China, even for Germany, which would be the obvious, kind of outlier, is still the whole Europe the largest trading partner is, of course, first of all, ourselves, because we are a very integrated market. But beyond that is the US, not China. So if there is two places in the world or two blocks in the world that are not as dependent from China, this is us. Nobody else can do this unless we start. And the point is, once you have that, as I said, that this block, it doesn't mean you are alone. So for your question, I mean, there's two big buts, because I don't want to look like this is easy. The first but is technology. If we are technologically dependent, then we're trapped. But frankly speaking, and this is, I know that Europe looks like technologically incapable. This is only true for a few sectors. Actually, in 5G, no matter what people say, we have companies, more expensive, but certainly companies that can do that. It's a question of cost. For other sectors, AI, etc., maybe India can offer other solutions. And by the way, if you do this open access, you can have other countries that are innovative that can jump along. You could eventually even have South Korea or Japan. So the whole idea is, I'm sure that many others would come along. Anything that doesn't look aligned to one of the two hegemons. Sorry to use the word again. But that's it. And the thing I can't solve, though, is security. But,
Yeah.
but if we have our own technology, if we do not need to rely on China for technology, I don't think the US will jump on us because of our own technology. So the trick here is to be non-reliant from China for technology. And frankly speaking, after years and years looking into the Chinese economy, I have to say that China is not yet at the front of technology, except for very few sectors. So we can't overdo this story.
Yeah.
China cannot produce 5G without semiconductors. So basically, I think we're overdoing their strength, and we should be more, faithful in what we can do. And I leave it there.
Thank you very much. That gives me a great sense of reassurance that perhaps we are not as dependent as it sometimes seems to be the case. But again, I come back to what is it that we can, in practical terms, do to take our relationship forward, and whether or not something like what we were aiming at in 2005, of course, in now very different circumstances, whether that is possible. And let me say that there would be a greater comfort level in India dealing with Europe than perhaps with, say, even the United States or others. I mean, there is that aspect also which needs to be taken into account. But the last point that you made, that how do we wrap our minds around the security issue? I'm afraid that this has become such a major concern that we will have to find a way. We'll have to find a way around it. So before I give the floor to Andre, there are a couple of questions. In fact, the questions relate to Alicia's presentation. So Alicia, perhaps if you can give a very quick response. One is that while we are, in a sense, talking in an idiom of nation states, so the decisions seem to be mostly on a national sort of basis. Of course, in Europe, it is also on a Europe-wide basis. But we are talking today about a global economy where national borders are becoming less relevant. We are talking about technology, which also, it's very difficult to sort of cut it into sort of separate pieces. We also have the reality that the big high-tech companies, in a sense, are ruling the roost as far as the technology side is concerned. And you have major issues of privacy. You have issues of how in fact COVID-19 has even in a sense, strengthen the influence of these high-tech companies. So on the one hand, we are talking about how we don't want to, be put in a trap. We are talking about how we could perhaps create a kind of a third force, if you like. But the reality seems to be, at least that's the sense I got from the question, that how do we take into account these other factors? That, whether we like it or not, even though COVID-19 may have sort of stalled or in a sense slowed down globalization, that is here to stay. And it is making it very difficult for countries to really take independent sovereign decisions. And secondly, we have this whole reality of, as I said, the 4 or 5 high-tech companies which are essentially dominating, and they are entrenched in the high technology field. So how do we deal with that? Alicia, very short answer, please.
Well, I guess in a nutshell, we are security dependent on the US, technologically still dependent on the US, economically not so dependent on China as we think we are. So how do we deal with this? I think basically I got a question on whether technological independence is too expensive. I'm sorry to say, I've heard this many times. For an area of the size of Europe, Europe should be, not in every form, because this is why we believe in globalization and comparative advantage, but in many forms, not in all, technologically independent is big enough Europe to be, I don't know why we have come to the conclusion that being technologically independent is too expensive. It is much more expensive to be technologically dependent. This is the whole idea of development theory, yeah? So my answer would be, at least for certain key sectors, you need to be technologically independent. And that would bring down the power of what you just said, this big few tech companies, because there would be more options. It would be even good for competition. Otherwise, you just end up in a global oligopoly. So I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be thriving towards technological independence, not in every sector, but at least in some sectors.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have only about 5 or so minutes left for this session. Andre has been waiting very patiently to make his concluding remarks and perhaps share some of his perspectives with us. Andre, perhaps you could also answer a couple of questions which have been raised. For example, Rakesh Mohan has raised the issue that we are talking about security as being such a big concern. How come that despite the very sensitive security concerns, Taiwan is the largest investor in China? That has been mentioned. So is that really such a constraint in terms of our economic relationships going forward? So Andre, you have the floor for the concluding words.
Thank you, Sham, and thank you to Guntram and to Alicia for and the three of you really for really a fascinating discussion. It proves that I think it was right to start this seminar, this webinar, which is meant to be oriented towards some of the big economic issues like trade, like climate, like technology. But it was right to frame that into this geopolitical discussion. And I think you're right, Sham, to insist of the fact that how do we disentangle the economics from the security? I think this is really the heart of the matter, and this is also, in a sense, very much the heart of the new discussion in Europe. So I would say my conclusion is the following: the points that were made about the landscape, no doubt, there are two words that are dominating, or that dominated the discussion of the landscape, which is US and China. Okay, there are all the countries and obviously India and the European Union. But for us, the landscape, first and foremost, does mean, and I think that was the heart of the discussion, the US and China. And in a sense, there is the obsession that we have both in India and in Europe is, where do we fit in into this world? It's true that, and then I think Alicia showed that very well in a first chart, is that from an economic perspective, India and the European Union are to some extent belonging to the first division, to the first tier, together with China and the United States in terms of our economic size, in terms of the growth, certainly in terms of population. I mean, if you look those kind of indicators, we are there. We are right there. When you look at the defense, the foreign policy, there clearly we are second tier, right? And I think this tension between our economic / demographic size on the one hand and our security / technology size on the other is what is all the time pushing us, where do we fit with them? And I mean, interesting the idea of Alicia, this alliance of the non-aligned. I was sort of at the same time fascinated by this proposal. And Alicia you said that yourself, is this a naive? And I think I think we should take seriously that discussion, because naive ideas can be in fact very novel ideas. But yes, we can't sort of get away from this disentangling. Are we able to disentangle the security and the economic? And I think indeed the heart of that discussion does lie into the technology. For us in Europe, and we do have indeed this discussion, which is now occupying much space about strategic sovereignty or strategic autonomy, not completely unlike what you in India call self-reliance, and which doesn't mean close to the world, right? And in many people in Europe are now using the notion of open strategic autonomy to insist that self-reliance maybe on some dimension doesn't mean at all that we are cutting ourselves from the rest of the world, which would be foolish, certainly from an economic and in the end security perspective. But I think it's right to say that for us in Europe, you remember that we are coming from really being dominated by, although Europe had always a political vision, our political vision was an internal, right, to deal with peace within Europe. But the means were economic. We were the European Economic Community. Then it's the single market dominated the issue, then the euro. So for us, these issues of geopolitics, it's completely new to Brussels. It was never part of the discussion. And you are very right that when we had bilateral discussion, and you, Sham, were involved in those between Europe and India on the trade agreement, this was looked purely via the economic lens. It was never looked from also a geopolitical lens. That lens did not exist in Brussels. So now, yes, we are starting to change ourselves in Europe and see that indeed you can't look, given our size, you can't look, and given also this landscape that you have been discussing, you can't anymore look purely at some of those economic matters through only the economic lens, right? You need to have the second lens, which is the geopolitical, and it's the interaction between those two lenses that is, I think, creating this new discussion for us in Europe, and I think this new bilateral discussion that we're having today as to where do we fit, the two of us, and what does it mean also for this, maybe potential alliance of the non-aligned. I'm old enough, like some of you, to remember, obviously, the non-aligned of a previous generation. And I don't know whether that was a highly successful alliance, the G77 and, you know, the non-aligned. But one saw where it came from, and there are certainly lessons to be learned from there. So let me simply invite all of our friends, all of our listeners, all the participants, to join us again this afternoon. This afternoon for us in Brussels, this evening for you in India. This is now in 45 minutes. We are going to have the second leg of our 4-leg webinar. And now we are getting into sort of the more issues, but we will have the benefit of looking at the second session, which will be devoted to trade. We will have the benefit of looking at the trade matters via the discussion, or through the lens of the discussion that we have had now. You know, the landscape, you know, it not just be a discussion like it was 15 years ago, back in 2005. It's a new world. It's a new world where indeed, you know, we need to position ourselves and to have this discussion on trade, both bilaterally, but certainly also very much in a multilateral fashion at the WTO, keeping in mind that the world is changing very, very rapidly. And what is it that we, India and the EU, want to do together, both in bilateral fora and in multilateral fora. So let me thank all the speakers. Let me thank very much my co-chair Sham for, you know, master discussion, and invite everybody to join us again in 45 minutes for a discussion on trade. So from me, I'm saying goodbye and see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll
Bye-bye.
conclude this session. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Do we log off now and later on again, or? Yes.
Praveen, if you could just put on the poster so that, yeah, so the link will be on and we will reconvene at 45 minutes from now.
Great, thank you. That was a great start.
So you're back on again. I can't hear you. Your mic is off.
I just decided not to leave and just mute myself and stop the video and come back later.
Yeah, but we're still live. Hello,
Oh.
Praveen. Could you just put on the screen and do the thing, whatever is required? The session is over. Hello. Yeah. Okay, so we shall just reconvene 45 minutes from now. This link will be on. Hope to see everyone again back here by Indian time 6:30 and by CET 2 p.m.
Okay, thanks, Sandeep. See you later.